Well, legislation to expand the capital gains tax will be separate from the government's main budget motion, despite the fact it is a major plank of the Liberals' fiscal plan. This prompted journalists to ask why the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, denied it was about wedging the Conservatives, but also did not explain the reason behind the move.
The purpose of our budget, the central goal of our budget, is fairness for every generation. It is recognizing that we need to unlock the promise of Canada for millennials and Gen Z, and it's recognizing we need to make significant investments to do that.
Meanwhile, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has taken a look at the numbers in the plan, and joining us right now is the PBO, Yves Giroux. Mr. Giroux, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Listen, I know that the government plan to deal with the capital gains adjustments separately is not necessarily in your report, but I do want to begin there because given the fact that it will be considered separately, not in the budget bill, does that in any way worry you about the kind of assessment you can give to the government economic plan?
Regardless of whether something is included in one budget implementation act or another, it does not prevent us from looking at a specific issue. In that case, the capital gains inclusion rate, we were planning on taking a deeper look at that anyways. So whether it's in BIA 1, BIA 2, or as a standalone instrument, legislative instrument, we'll have a look at that no matter what. The moment it's mentioned in a budget and it is a government policy, and also considering the level of interest that there is for this topic, it's something we will be looking into no matter where it is implemented, whether it be a budget implementation act or another vehicle.
Okay, so keeping an eye for that. Let's talk about what is in your report. And funnily enough, I actually want to begin with fiscal 23-24 because there was $1.8 billion set aside for new measures. Those measures, though, as you noted, were never announced. How problematic is that?
Well, it's a bit problematic for very good reasons. It does not allow parliamentarians to do their work of scrutinizing public spending and challenging the government on its spending plans. If they don't know what these amounts are for, there's very little way or no way for them to know whether it's a legitimate expenditure or set aside and what it's being spent on or what it will be spent on. It's most likely for legal liabilities, given that it was for last fiscal year, but there's no certain way of knowing that, especially for parliamentarians. So in that sense, it's worrisome from an accountability and transparency perspective.
Mm-hmm. So at that point then, are you calling on the government to detail what exactly that money is being used for?
It would be a good idea for the government to at least tell us categories of expenditures that are included in that. Everybody understands that you don't want the government to itemize its estimated legal liabilities when it's being sued by fear of revealing its hand and then whatever amount it has set aside to become the ceiling for a settlement. But in aggregate, the government could tell us that so much is for the anticipated settlement of legal liabilities. That amount is for benefits and the cost of future benefits that has to be booked in a given year. So we can have a better idea as to the purpose of these amounts, much more granular and refined than just a provision.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of numbers, you also write the fact that your office, the projected budgetary deficits from PBO are $5.3 billion higher annually on average over 23-24 all the way up to 28-29. So higher than what the finance minister laid out in 2024 budget. Why the discrepancy here?
It's mostly related to a different perspective on the level of nominal GDP going forward. So we anticipate that the economic growth will be roughly in the ballpark of what the Minister of Finance has indicated, but the minister has tabled or is tabling on or counting on slightly higher GDP inflation than what we are estimating. And GDP inflation means that nominal GDP is slightly higher in the Minister of Finance's budget than in our own economic and fiscal outlook. And because the nominal GDP is the broadest definition of the tax base, then there's a small difference between our numbers and the government's numbers related to the government revenues, mostly on the personal income tax side.
Okay, so that's the work behind the conclusion. But what will that actually do to the fiscal anchor that this government, really does continue to use as its measure? Will they actually get to the debt to GDP ratio below 1% by 26-27, as they predict, if their numbers are slightly off than what you're looking at?
Well, their fiscal anchor is twofold. One, a declining debt to GDP ratio in the medium term, which will be difficult to do, but they're playing on words to ensure that they are indeed meeting that fiscal anchor. And the second anchor, which you alluded to, is a deficit of 1% of GDP or lower in 2026-27 and ongoing. And on that front, it will be much more difficult to attain without increasing taxes or reducing expenditures in many areas, because based on the budget, the deficit is expected to be 0.9% of GDP in 26-27. And there's 2 budgets still to go between now and that fiscal year. We've seen what the government is keen on doing. It has a propensity to introduce new measures and introduce new spending measures. So that doesn't leave them much room for maneuver in 26-27 if they want to meet that 1% target, the deficit relative to the GDP, without increasing taxes.
Okay, and yes, deficit to GDP, because I tripped on that, so thank you for the clarity. But before you go, because we're quickly running out of time though, on the matter of savings, the government is looking to reduce the size of the public service. They're going to do this through attrition. But there's also this number of new social programs that also need to be run. Will the government have to make cuts to the public service to meet the 5,000 reduction goal?
Well, if on a net basis, they really mean cutting 5,000 employees from the current levels, and they also deliver on all these programs and initiatives and spending items in the budget, many of which will require a substantial number of public servants. So if they want to deliver on all these, for example, CRA call centers improving their performance, and that's just one example. So if they deliver on all these budget measures, and they also reduce the overall number of public servants by 5,000 over 4 years, they will have to cut in other sectors of government. Otherwise, there is no way they can reduce 5,000 employees, deliver on budget measures, and not cut anywhere. That's just not working.
Yves Giroux, I wish we had more time, but I always appreciate the clarity on things. Thank you for the time tonight.
Always a pleasure.